On the northern shore of Lake Ontario, at the edge of a small town that has spent a century and a half trying to be picturesque, there's a stretch of land that looks, from the road, like it might have been a school once, or a college, or perhaps a hospital of the ordinary kind. Some of the original red brick buildings still stand. The grounds are kept. The trees are old enough to have seen everything. The admission ledger for this facility, the Cobourg Hospital for the Insane, later renamed the Ontario Hospital Cobourg, renamed again and again as the language of each decade tried to put some distance between itself and what the place actually was. That ledger exists. It sits in the archives of Ontario. Researchers who have studied it describe a column, narrow and parallel, running down the right side of each page. The column is headed Cause, and beneath it, in the careful handwriting of whatever intake physician was on duty the week each woman arrived, the same phrases appear with a regularity that has no clinical explanation. Feeble-minded, moral deficiency, illegitimate pregnancy. This is the story of the Ontario Hospital Cobourg. To understand what Cobourg was built to do, you need to understand what Ontario believed it was managing. In the first decade of the 20th century, the province's most urgent social anxieties converged around a single figure, the feeble-minded woman. She was not a medical category in any rigorous clinical sense. She was a projection, a vessel for everything that the Protestant moral economy of English-speaking Ontario feared about female sexuality operating outside of marriage, about poverty reproducing itself, about the working class producing children that the middle class would eventually have to accommodate. The term feeble-minded had entered medical usage in the late 19th century as a catch-all for cognitive and developmental conditions that the emerging field of psychiatry had not yet learned to distinguish from one another. By 1900, it had expanded so far beyond any defensible clinical meaning that it had become, in practice, an administrative category, a designation that a physician could assign to a woman based on a 20-minute interview, a reading test, or simply on the testimony of a family member who found her behavior troubling. Ontario's Chief Inspector of the Feeble-Minded, a position created in 1906, was held for 13 years by a physician named Dr. Helen McMurtry. She was, by any measure of her era, an exceptional professional. Educated, prolific, politically connected, tireless, she published reports, lectured widely, corresponded with legislators across the country. She was not a fringe figure. She was the center. And from that center, year after year, she produced government documents, official provincial reports, submitted to the Ontario legislature, read into the record, that described feeble-minded women in language that had no clinical distance in it whatsoever. In her 1910 report, she referred to the feeble-minded woman as a menace to the race, not a patient requiring treatment, a menace requiring containment. McMurtry left the inspector's position in 1919 for a federal appointment, Chief of Child Welfare for the Dominion of Canada, from which she continued producing reports, receiving honors, and shaping national policy until her retirement in 1934. In 1934, she was awarded the Commander of the British Empire. The citation mentioned her distinguished contribution to public health. The Ontario Hospital Cobourg occupied a parcel of land on the eastern edge of the town, bordered on the south by a gentle slope toward the lake, and on the north by farmland. The institution itself worked. The main administrative building was constructed in the Victorian institutional style, red brick, 3 stories, symmetrical, with a roofline that combined modest Gothic elements with the utilitarian aspirations of late 19th century provincial architecture. Wide verandas ran the length of both the eastern and western facades, designed to allow supervised outdoor time in a setting that looked, from a distance, almost like a country resort. The grounds were deliberately composed, elm trees along the eastern walk, a kitchen garden behind the residential wings, a gravel path that curved from the main gate to the front entrance of the administrative building in a gentle arc that softened visually the fact that the gate at the end of it locked from the outside. The front entrance hall was large by the standards of provincial institutions, oak woodwork on the lower walls, a varnished reception desk, behind which the intake physician sat, a row of chairs against the wall, where new arrivals waited. The windows were tall, admitting generous afternoon light. The floors were kept clean. The women who entered through that door typically did so dressed in their ordinary clothes, carrying whatever they had been allowed to bring, sometimes a case, sometimes a paper bag, sometimes nothing. They walked from the reception desk to a back corridor that connected the administrative building to the first residential wing. The corridor smelled of institutional soap and floor wax. The residential wing held single and double rooms in the upper floors and dormitory spaces in the lower. Long rooms with iron-framed beds arranged in rows, 8 to a room in the single-sex wards, more when population pressure required it. Each bed had a blanket and a pillow. The windows in the residential wing were narrower than those in the administrative building, set higher in the wall to prevent use as an exit, and fitted with frames that opened only a few inches. The laundry was in the basement of the north wing, a long room with deep sinks and mechanical wringers, where steam rose in the mornings to the ceiling and settled there. The farms attached to the institution occupied a substantial portion of the northern grounds. There was a dairy operation, a vegetable plot large enough to supply most of the institution's produce, a chicken house, a root cellar of considerable depth dug into the slope behind the main building. It was, on a clear day in late September, when the elms were turning and the lake was visible through the southern trees, a genuinely beautiful piece of land. The intake physician's desk sat 15 feet from the main entrance. The ledger sat on the desk. In the column-headed cause, the same phrase appeared across decade after decade, in a changing succession of handwritings. Feeble-minded. Feeble-minded. Moral deficiency. Feeble-minded. The rooms where women slept and worked and waited for something to change looked, from the outside, like rooms in a place designed for their recovery. In the institution's early decades, between its formal opening in 1902 and the beginning of the Second World War, something resembling a structured daily life existed inside its walls. The Cobourg facility, like other Ontario hospitals for the insane of this period, operated under a philosophy of moral treatment that had been in circulation in psychiatry since the mid-19th century. The idea was straightforward and, in its original formulation, not unkind. That productive routine, fresh air, purposeful occupation, and regular religious observance could restore the disordered mind to function. The morning schedule at Cobourg in the 1920s moved through breakfast in the communal dining room, followed by work assignments distributed by the ward nurse. Female patients with physical capacity were assigned to the laundry, the kitchen, the cleaning of the residential wings, and the seasonal work of the farm, picking, preserving, harvesting according to what the grounds required. Those judged capable of more skilled work sewed uniforms, washed and mended institutional linens, and worked in the administrative building itself, in capacities that functioned, in all practical terms, as clerical and domestic service. On Sunday mornings, the women who were ambulatory attended chapel in the institution's small worship room. Hymns were sung. A minister from town came on the second Sunday of each month. In the afternoon, there were, in some wards, organized activities, needlework in the common room, supervised walks along the eastern path, occasional moving picture screenings in the facility's social hall during the 1930s. Letters could be written and sent, subject to review by the ward physician. What Cobourg's programming did not include, in any year of its operation, was a systematic mechanism for reassessing whether the women inside it still met the criteria for continued detention. An annual medical review existed on paper. In practice, physicians documented that a patient's condition was unchanged or stable, language that served the institution's administrative interest in maintaining a stable, unpaid labor force, and served nothing else. Stability, in this context, did not lead to release. It led to continued residency in the laundry. The women who arrived at Cobourg in those early decades were told, in some cases, that they would be there for a short period. An assessment, a rest, a chance to recover from whatever had brought them to the attention of the physician who signed their committal form. That time, in case after case, extended. Months became years. Years became a decade. The institution offered no mechanism for a woman to challenge her own committal. She could write to her family. If her family had delivered her to Cobourg in the first place, the letter arrived and was read and went no further. The Second World War took staff from Ontario's psychiatric institutions, the way it took staff from everywhere. Trained nurses and male orderlies who left for overseas service or for war industry, work that paid better than institutional wages. By 1945, Cobourg was running at a staffing ratio that its own administration documented as inadequate in internal correspondence that went upward to the Department of Health and was noted and returned without remedy. After the war, the shortage did not correct. The economy that expanded around veterans' benefits, suburban housing, and consumer production had no particular interest in producing nurses for provincial asylums, where the conditions were difficult and the pay was calibrated for women who had no better options. By 1950, the ratio of registered nursing staff to patients in Ontario's psychiatric hospitals was documented at levels that made individual clinical attention to any resident effectively impossible. At Cobourg, a ward nurse responsible for 40 women could not conduct a meaningful clinical interview, monitor medication responses, provide any consistent therapeutic contact, or review any resident's case for possible discharge. The ward operated on containment logic: meals distributed, medications administered, any outbreaks of distress managed with whatever physical means were available. The budget allocated per patient by the Ontario Department of Health in 1952 was 62 cents per day. That figure covered food, medication, laundry, and all operating costs. It did not cover the labor of the patients themselves, because that labor was not classified as labor. It was classified as therapy. The province was running an institution of several hundred women on 62 cents each per day, was receiving from those women a significant portion of the laundry, kitchen, and agricultural labor that kept the institution operational, and was paying them nothing. This was not a secret. The Ontario Department of Health published annual reports. The patient labor system appeared in those reports, described in the vocabulary of occupational therapy and the therapeutic benefits of purposeful work. The discrepancy between that vocabulary and the economic reality of what the province was receiving went unexamined in public discourse for years. The women in the laundry did not have a union. Something had been building inside these wards for a long time, and the women bearing the weight of it were about to run out of room to bear it quietly. By the late 1950s, the residential wards at Cobourg had been physically reorganized in ways that replaced whatever therapeutic pretense had existed in earlier decades with a more openly custodial arrangement. Dormitory spaces that had held 8 beds were expanded to hold 12 and then 16, with beds positioned to leave only a narrow passage between them. The common rooms, once used for organized activities, were largely cleared of furniture, producing large empty spaces where women who were not on work assignment spent the hours sitting, pacing, or in whatever pattern of self-occupation their individual circumstances had produced. The isolation rooms in the basement of the North Wing, formerly designated as strong rooms in institutional records, held patients during periods of acute distress, in a space with a padded interior, a single locked door, and a small window set too high to see through. The duration of isolation episodes was recorded in ward logs. Some entries documented stays of several days. The clinical rationale was noted as for patients' protection. The specific behaviors that had warranted the placement were not always enumerated. Physical restraints, wrist and ankle, leather cuffs attached to bed frames, appeared in Cobourg's inventory records throughout this period. Their use was not exceptional. It was routine, documented with the same clinical flatness as medication administration or meal records. Women who arrived at Cobourg with intact cognitive function, committed not for any clinical reason, but for the social offense of being unmarried and pregnant, were housed in these same wards, subject to these same conditions, classified in these same files as feeble-minded. Their files did not distinguish between their circumstances and those of women with genuine and significant cognitive impairments. The ledger treated them identically. The institution treated them identically. The lake, visible through the narrow upper windows on clear days, was approximately a quarter of a mile from the southern wall of the residential wing. Some women had not seen it in years. The diagnostic category that Cobourg's physicians applied to the majority of its female population, feeble-minded, and its subspecification, moral deficiency, was not a clinical entity with established neurological markers, standardized testing protocols, or reproducible diagnostic criteria. It was an administrative designation that expanded or contracted, depending on what the institution and the province found convenient to contain. In the early decades of the century, a physician could assign a feeble-mindedness designation following a brief clinical interview that assessed the patient's ability to read a simple passage, recall a short sequence of numbers, and answer questions about her domestic management. Women who were poor, whose education had been interrupted, who spoke English as a second language, or who were simply terrified and disoriented by the clinical encounter performed poorly on these assessments. Their poor performance was recorded as evidence of deficiency. The circularity was total and unacknowledged. The moral deficiency subspecification was applied to women who had committed no cognitive failure at all, women who had borne children outside of marriage, who had engaged in sexual relationships that a physician or a family member found morally objectionable, who had worked in occupations that carried a social stigma, or who had simply been found in circumstances that respectable Ontario could not frame as anything but deviance. There was no cognitive test for moral deficiency. There was a judgment. The judgment belonged to the physician who signed the committal form. That physician's judgment was not subject to appeal by the woman being assessed. The committal process under Ontario's Mental Hospitals Act required the signature of 2 physicians. In many documented cases, one of those physicians was the family doctor who had been approached by the woman's father or husband seeking a remedy for her behavior. The second was often a colleague willing to co-sign on the basis of the first physician's professional endorsement. The woman herself was rarely present for the diagnostic conversation between them. Once signed, the committal could be completed within 48 hours. The woman was transported by family member, by constable, or in some cases by the husband who had initiated the process, to the institution's front entrance. The intake physician reviewed the paperwork. The ledger was opened, the name was entered, no court hearing was required. No advocate represented the woman's interests. No judge reviewed the medical opinion before the door closed behind her. Inside the institution, the daily experience of women committed on the basis of unwed pregnancy differed from what the provincial brochures of any decade described in every particular that mattered. Women who arrived at Cobourg while pregnant were delivered of their children in the facility's medical wing. In documented cases across multiple Ontario institutions of this period, and the Cobourg records are consistent with the documented pattern, the child was removed from the mother within hours of birth. In some cases, the woman was told the child had not survived. In documented cases, the child was alive and had been transferred to a provincial adoption placement. The mother was returned to the ward. The ward record noted the delivery and its outcome. What it did not note, in any clinical detail, was what happened to the woman in the weeks that followed. Women who had been committed for the diagnostic cause of illegitimate pregnancy, women who had exhibited no cognitive deficit, who could read, who could write, who could reason about their circumstances with complete lucidity, remained classified as feeble-minded after the birth. The event that had prompted their committal was gone. The designation that had justified it remained. Because the designation had never been tied to anything that could change, it did not change. They were assigned to the laundry. They washed the institutional linens 6 days a week in steam-filled rooms without pay, under the therapeutic rationale of occupational benefit. The steam condensed on the ceiling and dripped back down. Women who attempted to contact legal authorities about their situation, those who understood that a mechanism might exist, that a letter to a solicitor or a member of the legislature might produce a review, found that outgoing mail was subject to ward physician review. Letters that expressed distress about the committal were noted in the file as evidence of the patient's ongoing agitation. The note was used to justify continued placement. Women who expressed persistent and articulate objections to their confinement received in the records an annotation, lacks insight into her condition. The lack of insight that concerned the physicians was the woman's refusal to accept that she belonged where she was. That refusal was itself diagnostic evidence. In the circular logic of institutional psychiatry, of the deficiency that had brought her there, the children removed at birth were not logged into the patient's file in any way that would allow, decades later, a systematic reconstruction of what had happened. The adoption records and the institution's medical records were maintained separately. The separation was not accidental. It was the architecture of unaccountability, built file by file across 60 years. One physician, one ward, 40 women in beds the length of a long corridor, and somewhere in the provincial archive system, 40 separate files that would take a researcher years to locate, cross-reference, and understand as what they were. But some of those files have names in them. So let us remember 3 of those names. The records of the Ontario Hospital Cobourg in the Archives of Ontario identify a woman admitted in September of 1928. The admission document records her name as Edith R., age 23, domestic servant, reason for admission, feeble-minded, moral deficiency, history of multiple pregnancies. The referring physician was her employer's family doctor. The co-signing physician was a colleague to whom the family doctor referred the case without conducting a separate examination. Edith had 3 children by the time she was admitted. 2 had been placed in orphanages. 1 was being raised by her mother in a village outside Cobourg. None of the children were mentioned in her institutional file after the admission date, because none of them were considered relevant to her clinical management. She had been a domestic servant since the age of 14. She could read, she could write. Her handwriting in the few preserved documents from her file is clear and confident. She managed a household, maintained a budget, organized her employer's social calendar. In any clinical assessment oriented toward functional capability rather than moral compliance, she would have passed without difficulty. She was assigned to the laundry within her first week. Edith remained at the Ontario Hospital Cobourg for 31 years. She was released in 1959 at the age of 54 under a new provincial policy that attempted to reduce institutional population through supervised boarding arrangements in private homes. The release document noted that her condition was unchanged, but that she was judged capable of functioning in a supervised setting. It had always been possible for her to function in a supervised setting. She had been doing it for 20 years in the laundry. She spent the last years of her life in a boarding house in Hamilton. She never located her children. Agnes Conboy arrived at Cobourg in March of 1937. She was 17 years old. She had come from Ireland 3 years earlier with an aunt who had since died, leaving Agnes working in a Cobourg household as a general servant with no local family connections. When her employer discovered she was pregnant, the physician was called. The physician determined that a young woman in her circumstances, immigrant, Catholic, unmarried, pregnant, without family support, represented a case of moral deficiency requiring institutional placement. Agnes delivered a boy in the Cobourg Medical Wing in June of 1937. A nurse told her the baby was being taken to a warm room because he was small. Agnes waited. A physician came to her room and told her, in clinical language that she later recalled in a letter, one of the few that survived review, amounted to an instruction not to ask about the child again. She asked about him every year for the next 11 years. The notation in her file reads, repeatedly, across 11 annual reviews. Patient exhibits persistent agitation regarding former infant, lacks insight. In 1948, the notation reads for the first time, patient has accepted her situation. Agnes was 31 years old. She was released in 1955 at the age of 35 with a discharge summary that described her as a cooperative patient who had benefited significantly from the structured environment of the institution. She moved to Toronto. She worked as a laundress. She knew the work. She died in 1979 without ever knowing where her son had been placed, or what his name was, or whether he had lived. The third name in these records appears only as initials in the original file, ML, admitted in 1951 at the age of 16, transferred from a juvenile court placement after a magistrate accepted a physician's recommendation that her persistent, immoral behavior, the clinical term in the record, warranted institutional management rather than penal sanction. ML had been pregnant twice before her 16th birthday. The second pregnancy had ended in a stillbirth while she was in a temporary provincial detention facility. The first child had been removed. ML is not a composite. She appears in research conducted by Canadian historians of psychiatry who have worked through the Archives of Ontario. Her full name is known to those researchers. She requested that it not be published during her lifetime. She was released from Cobourg in 1968 at the age of 33 after 17 years of institutional confinement that began when she was 16 years old and had committed no crime for which a court had convicted her. The discharge documentation describes her as institutionally adjusted. It recommends that she be monitored by a community health visitor. She found a room in Oshawa. She found work. She gave one recorded interview to an advocacy group working on mental health institutional reform in the late 1970s, in which she said, "I was 16 years old. They told me I needed help. I did not know what help looked like, but I knew that this was not it." She died in 2003. The Ontario government had not, by that date, issued any formal acknowledgement of what had been done to her or to the women who had passed through the same doors. These 3 women represent hundreds more. Some of those hundreds have no names in any record that has been made accessible. Some of them died inside. Their deaths were recorded as natural. No external review examined the conditions that preceded them. The first serious internal challenge to Cobourg's committal practices did not come from a court, or a newspaper, or an advocacy organization. It came from inside the Department of Health itself. In 1961, a provincial review was commissioned by the department following concerns raised, internally and quietly, about the demographic profile of Cobourg's long-term female population. The review was conducted by a team of assessors who administered standardized cognitive evaluations to a representative sample of women who had been classified as feeble-minded on admission and who remained classified as such in their current files, some of them a decade or 2 decades after arrival. The findings were documented in a report that remained classified within the Department of Health for more than 20 years. The report found that a significant proportion of the women evaluated, the specific percentage has been reported in historical research at somewhere between 20 and 30% of the sample, showed no clinical markers consistent with intellectual disability by the standards then current. They were not feeble-minded. They had never been feeble-minded. They had been admitted under a designation that had been applied without clinical basis and had been left in place because there was no institutional mechanism for correcting it. The Department of Health's response to this finding was not to release those women. It was not to commission a full review of all long-term commitments. It was not to alert the women's families. The response was to file the report. The women whose evaluations had prompted it remained in their wards and their laundry assignments and their beds with the narrow windows. The report was not published. Its existence was not acknowledged publicly. In the same year that report was filed, the Ontario Medical Association presented its annual Distinguished Service Award. The citation honored a career in the advancement of institutional psychiatry in Ontario. It praised, specifically, the development of diagnostic frameworks for identifying and managing the feeble-minded population of the province. The frameworks being praised were the ones the classified report had just documented as the instrument of wrongful imprisonment for dozens of women who were, at that moment, still inside. The first sustained public attention to what had been happening inside Ontario's psychiatric institutions came not from within the medical establishment, but from a combination of legal advocacy and journalism that accelerated through the late 1960s and 1970s. Legal aid clinics in Toronto and Hamilton began in the early 1970s, receiving contact from former patients of provincial institutions who wanted help understanding whether their committals had been procedurally proper. The lawyers who reviewed these cases found, consistently, that the Medical Hospitals Act had been applied in ways that gave no genuine legal protection to the person being committed. A woman's own testimony about her circumstances, her cognitive function, her desire not to be institutionalized. None of this had any procedural weight against the signatures of 2 physicians and a magistrate's order. In 1974, the Ontario Legislature's Committee on Mental Health held public hearings. Former patients testified. Social workers testified about conditions they had observed. A small number of current and former institutional staff gave evidence, not all of it supportive of the status quo, about what they had seen during their employment. The hearings produced a report. The report recommended amendments to the Mental Health Act that would establish a patient's right to legal representation, a right to challenge their committal before an independent tribunal, and mandatory periodic review of all long-term placements. The amendments were passed in 1978. The women who had needed those protections in 1934, in 1937, in 1951, in 1961, were not retroactively acknowledged by their passage. The records of the Ontario Hospital Cobourg, admissions, discharges, ward logs, medical files, were transferred to the Archives of Ontario, following the facility's gradual closure through the 1970s and early 1980s. Access to those records is governed by the province's privacy legislation, which protects the identities of individuals named therein. That protection is legitimate and necessary. It has also, in practice, made comprehensive historical research into the institution's committal patterns exceptionally difficult for anyone who is not a credentialed researcher with institutional access and years to invest in it. The classified 1961 review was not fully released to researchers until the early 1990s. By that time, most of the women whose evaluations it had documented were either dead or elderly. The physicians who had signed their committal forms were also dead. Their licenses, in most cases, had expired naturally. The architecture of wrongful committal that Ontario built through its feeble-minded designation did not stop at Cobourg's gate. Across the province, through the first half of the 20th century, the same diagnostic machinery ran inside multiple provincial institutions. The Hospital for the Feeble-Minded at Orillia, later known as the Huronia Regional Centre, processed thousands of residents under the same legislative framework, the same diagnostic categories, the same absence of meaningful oversight. Survivors of Huronia launched a class action lawsuit in 2010 that documented physical abuse, sexual abuse, and conditions of systematic neglect across the institution's decades of operation. The Ontario government settled the lawsuit in 2013 for $35 million. Premier Dalton McGuinty issued a formal apology. The apology was for Huronia. It was not extended to Cobourg or to the other Ontario institutions that had operated under the same framework. Alberta had moved further than Ontario. The Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928 had authorized the forcible sterilization of individuals deemed mentally defective by a provincial eugenics board. Between 1928 and the Act's repeal in 1972, approximately 2,800 Albertans were sterilized under its provisions. Leilani Muir, who had been wrongfully committed to the Provincial Training School for Mental Defectives at Red Deer and sterilized at the age of 14, sued the Alberta government in 1995 and won. Her case opened the door to further litigation. Alberta eventually paid more than $142 million in settlements to survivors and their families. The diagnostic categories that had justified her sterilization and that had filled Cobourg's wards had traveled internationally before they were ever seriously challenged domestically. The 1927 Buck v. Bell decision in the United States Supreme Court, which upheld forced sterilization of the feeble-minded, had referenced Canadian institutional practice as supporting evidence. The logic moved across borders in both directions. Canadian psychiatrists cited American research. American institutions cited Canadian administrative models. The feeble-mindedness framework that McMurchie had built into Ontario's annual reports became a data point in the international literature of eugenics science that other countries used to justify their own versions of the same project. The methods did not stop at any single border. The land on which the Ontario Hospital Cobourg stood has been repurposed. Some of the original buildings remain, the administrative wing, portions of the residential structure, incorporated into uses that do not draw attention to their provenance. The grounds are maintained. The trees that stood along the eastern walk are old now, the elms long gone to disease, replaced by species that were not planted when the institution was operating. A heritage designation covers the administrative building's exterior, noting its architectural significance as an example of Victorian institutional design in Ontario. The designation is accurate. The building is architecturally significant. The designation does not mention what the building was used for. It does not mention the ledger that sat on the intake physician's desk. It does not mention the column-headed cause. It does not name a single woman who entered through the front door and spent years or decades in the laundry behind it. There is no memorial on the grounds. There is no plaque listing the names of residents who died inside. There is no publicly accessible count of how many women were committed to Cobourg under the feeble-minded designation, how many were committed for the specific cause of unwed pregnancy, how many had their children removed without their consent, or how many spent more than a decade in the institution before any review of their case was attempted. Those figures exist, in fragmented form, across the archives. No provincial authority has assembled them into a public accounting. The lake is still visible from the southern edge of the property on clear days. The water is the same water. There are two Ontario Hospital Cobourgs. The first was the institution described in provincial brochures and annual Department of Health reports, a therapeutic environment offering structured care, purposeful occupation, medical management, and a humane alternative to the social abandonment of vulnerable women. That institution existed in the language of every official document produced about Cobourg for 8 decades. Its existence was the justification for the funding appropriations, the staffing appointments, the legislative framework, and the medical careers built inside it. The worst that could honestly be said of the first Cobourg was that it was underfunded, understaffed, and operating under diagnostic categories that had not kept pace with clinical science. The second was the institution that operated inside the same buildings, the one that committed women for the administrative convenience of their families and the moral anxieties of their communities, that removed their children at birth and told some of them those children had not survived, that extracted years of unpaid labor under the label of therapy, that classified every articulate objection to confinement as clinical evidence of the deficiency that had justified confinement in the first place, that ran an internal review finding wrongful commitment and filed it, that produced physicians who were honored and celebrated without a single license revoked for the most consequential errors any physician can make. The first Cobourg was the story the province told about itself. The second Cobourg was what existed when no one from outside was looking. They operated simultaneously, in the same wards, with the same women. The province has officially acknowledged the first. The second has not yet been named, by anyone with the authority to name it, in a document that carries legal or moral weight. How many women were committed to the Ontario Hospital Cobourg and to comparable provincial institutions for causes that were not clinical causes? The number has not been compiled in any document that is publicly available. How many children were removed from their mothers in that medical wing and placed for adoption in ways that left no record that could be followed? The adoptions are in one archive. The institutional medical files are in another. The bridge between them has not been built. How many of those children spent their lives not knowing who their mothers were, or where they had gone, or that they had gone somewhere, as opposed to simply not existing? These questions cannot be answered from outside a sustained, funded, government-authorized research effort directed at the Cobourg records and the records of comparable institutions across Ontario. That effort has not been undertaken. The province that built those institutions and maintains their archives has not undertaken it. The admission ledger is in the Archives of Ontario. It is a physical object, leather-bound, ruled in black ink, with a column down the right-hand side of each page. The column is headed Cause. A researcher who has handled it described the experience of reading it as one of reading a list of reasons that did not mean what they claimed to mean. Clinical language in service of something that was not clinical, repeated in the careful handwriting of a succession of physicians across 40 years of admission records. Each entry brief, each entry certain, each entry closing a door behind a name. The ledger still holds every name. The column headed Cause still says what it says. The women who lived under those entries spent their years inside buildings that are still standing. The language that put them there was never formally repudiated. The physicians whose signatures committed them were never publicly called to account. The 17-year-old whose name appeared in that April 1934 entry spent 22 years inside a building that the heritage designation describes as architecturally significant. Somewhere in the provincial archive system, her file exists. It has a discharge date. It has a final notation by a physician who, reviewing her case in 1956, determined that she no longer required institutional management. It does not have an apology. Some doors, once closed, require something more than time to open. The province of Ontario has the key. It has not yet decided whether to use it.